The struggle of the modern believer is often a quiet one that happens in the middle of a crowded room. You find yourself sitting in a church pew or at a kitchen table, holding a small piece of bread and a tiny cup, and you realize with a sense of internal honesty that you feel remarkably ordinary. Before we continue, comment, "Jesus, pray for me." There is no bolt of lightning, no sudden rush of emotion, and no grand cinematic shift in the atmosphere. You know the history of the act, you know the words that are supposed to be said, and you certainly love God, but the experience feels more like a religious obligation than a life-altering encounter. This is the weight of the routine. It is the subtle, creeping disconnect that happens when a profound spiritual reality is repeated so many times that it becomes a habit rather than an event. We have transformed the most revolutionary meal in human history into a 15-minute segment of a service that we navigate through muscle memory. We often find ourselves thinking about the errands we need to run, the difficult conversation we had earlier that morning, or the stress of the coming work week, all while the elements of communion are being passed through our hands. This isn't because we are rebellious or because we lack faith. It is because we have been conditioned to look for the sacred only in the spectacular. We expect the presence of God to arrive with a shout, so we miss the whisper contained in a simple crumb of bread. We have allowed the familiarity of the ritual to obscure the depth of the relationship it was designed to protect. We treat it as a religious tradition, a solemn pause that we have forgotten how to actually pause in. If we are being honest, many of us carry a flicker of guilt about this disconnect. We wonder if our lack of a profound emotional experience means that our spiritual life is somehow defective. We see others who seem moved to tears, and we wonder if we are missing a secret frequency. But the tragedy is not that we aren't feeling enough. The tragedy is that we have reduced the table to a performance. We have focused on the mechanics of the ceremony, the how and the when, while losing sight of the what. We have turned a shared feast into a private examination. Throughout human history, the act of eating together has always been the most fundamental way to define who we are and where we belong. To share a table is to share a life. When Jesus sat with his friends in that upper room, he wasn't giving a lecture on theology or establishing a cold religious rite. He was issuing an invitation into a state of belonging. The hidden meaning of this moment is often missed because we have mistaken the menu for the meal. We analyze the elements, we debate the doctrines, and we worry about our worthiness, all while the invitation to sit and be known goes unaccepted. The routine problem is actually a symptom of a deeper identity crisis. We have forgotten that the table is the one place in the world where we do not have to perform. It is the one place where our bank accounts, our job titles, our social standing, and even our recent failures are stripped away, leaving only the reality of grace. When we look at communion through this lens, we realize that the disconnect we feel is actually a call to come home. It is an invitation to stop trying to achieve a spiritual state and to start acknowledging a spiritual reality. In this journey, we aren't looking for a shocking secret or a hidden code that only the elite can understand. We are simply looking for the way back to the heart of the meal. We are looking for the way back to a place of identity, memory, and profound, unearned favor. If we can strip away the layers of religious expectation, we might find that the table is the most human, and yet the most sacred, place we will ever go. It is a place designed to recenter our souls in a world that is constantly trying to pull us apart. It is a sacred pause that reminds us that we are not the sum of our mistakes, nor are we the sum of our achievements. We are guests who have been invited by a host who knows us fully and loves us anyway. The weight of the routine is real, but it is not the final word. The final word is a promise of belonging. As we move into the history and the context of this table, we have to be willing to be quiet. We have to be willing to let go of the pressure to feel something big and instead be open to knowing something true. The truth is that you have a place. The truth is that the table is set. And the truth is that the most ordinary bread you will ever eat is carrying the most extraordinary message you will ever hear. We are moving past the guilt of the disconnect and into the warmth of the promise. The routine is the shell, but the life is in the seed. It is time to crack the shell and see what has been waiting for us all along. To truly understand why the act of breaking bread has the power to recenter our lives, we have to travel back to a small, crowded room in Jerusalem. It was a moment of high tension and deep emotion, set against the backdrop of the Passover, a meal that was already steeped in centuries of history and meaning. This wasn't a formal religious ceremony in the cold, detached way we often think of it today. It was a dinner. There was the sound of conversation, the smell of food, and the underlying knowledge among the group that their world was about to shift forever. When Jesus took the bread and the cup, he was stepping into a tradition of covenant. In our modern world, we tend to think of a covenant as a legal contract, something defined by fine print, obligations, and the threat of penalties. But in the ancient world, a covenant was something far more organic and profound. It was a promise of belonging. It was a way of saying, I am yours and you are mine. A covenant was the most solemn way two people could define a relationship. It wasn't about enforcing a set of rules. It was about establishing a shared life. When Jesus looked at his friends and spoke of the new covenant, he was introducing a new way of being human. He was offering a promise that no matter how far we might stray, no matter how much we might fail, and no matter how noisy or distracting the world becomes, we have an immovable place at his table. This covenant was a promise of unconditional grace that shifted the focus from human performance to divine faithfulness. He was essentially telling them that their identity was no longer rooted in their own ability to keep a law, but in his ability to keep a promise. Historians and scholars tell us that for the early Christians, this meal was the literal center of their community. It wasn't a tiny, symbolic snack at the end of a long lecture. It was a full, communal meal shared in homes. It was the place where the radical equality of the faith was practiced. In that room, the walls that the world had built were torn down. The slave sat next to the master, the rich sat with the poor, and the broken sat with the whole, all eating from the same loaf. The bread and the wine were the physical symbols of this shared existence. When Jesus gave thanks for the bread, he used the word Eucharisteo, which simply means gratitude. It is a striking thought. Jesus knew the cross was coming, he knew the suffering and the betrayal that lay ahead, and yet his primary posture at the table was one of thankfulness. He was inviting us into a relationship where we are seen, known, and loved for who we are, not for who we think we should be. The hidden meaning that we so often miss is the sheer, beautiful simplicity of the invitation. Jesus didn't ask for a perfect theological dissertation on how the bread becomes his body. He didn't ask for a list of accomplishments or a certificate of moral purity. He simply said, "Take and eat." This is an invitation to belong before you behave. It is a reminder that our identity isn't found in what we do for God, but in what God has done for us. The table is the physical manifestation of a promise that says, "You are home, and you are welcome here exactly as you are." When we understand the biblical context as one of relationship and promise, the elements in our hand stop being religious objects and start being a hand reached out in friendship. We realize that the Last Supper wasn't just a farewell, it was a foundational moment for a new family. It was the moment where the table of the law was replaced by the table of grace. If we can grasp the weight of that promise, the routine begins to break. We see that we aren't just performing an act of memory. We are participating in a living covenant that is as active today as it was in that upper room. The bread is the proof of the promise. The cup is the seal of the relationship. When we approach the table with this clarity, we aren't just following a tradition. We are stepping back into the presence of the one who promised never to leave us or forsake us. The most famous instruction Jesus gave regarding this meal is the phrase we have heard repeated in nearly every language and every tradition across the globe. "Do this in remembrance of me." For many of us, the word remembrance feels like a purely mental exercise. We think of it as a call to reach into the archives of our minds and try to recall a fact from a history book, or to look at a grainy, black and white photograph of a relative we never actually met. We assume that during the moments of communion, we are supposed to sit in a somber silence and try to manufacture a feeling of sadness about a tragedy that happened 2,000 years ago. We try to visualize the cross, the pain, and the darkness, and we feel like we have failed at remembering if we don't walk away feeling emotionally drained. But in the original context of the scriptures, the concept of remembrance, the word anamnesis, is much deeper and more active than a simple mental recall. It is not about looking backward at a dead history. It is about making a past reality a present experience. It is a way of saying, this story is my story, and these events define exactly who I am in this moment. Think about how we remember the most important milestones of our lives, such as an anniversary or a homecoming. When you celebrate an anniversary, you don't just think about the date on a calendar, you relive the commitment. You recenter your entire life around the promise you made. You aren't just thinking about the past, you are letting the past dictate your present identity. This is what the table is designed to do. It is a sacred pause that allows us to strip away the noise of the world and recenter our lives in the story of Christ. Remembrance is actually an act of radical defiance. We live in a world that is constantly trying to tell us who we are. Every advertisement, every social media notification, and every professional expectation is whispering a version of our identity to us. The world tells us that we are the sum of our mistakes. It tells us we are only as valuable as our bank accounts, our productivity, or our social standing. It tells us that we are not enough, and that we must strive to earn our place. When we take the bread and the cup, we are choosing to remember a different truth that contradicts everything the world says. We are remembering that we are forgiven, not based on our own efforts, but based on His sacrifice. We are remembering that we are valued, not for what we do, but for whose we are. We are remembering that grace, not judgment, is the final word over our lives. This kind of remembrance is rooted in a profound sense of gratitude. When we eat the bread, we are physically acknowledging that we are sustained by something completely outside of ourselves. We didn't bake the bread of life. We didn't pay the price for our own peace or manufacture our own salvation. We are, at our very core, recipients of a gift. In this sacred pause, we find a clarity that the world cannot provide. We realize that the things we spent the entire week worrying about, the deadlines, the opinions of others, the lingering anxieties, are not the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is the love expressed in the broken bread. Remembrance is the process of shedding the false identities we've picked up throughout the week and putting on our true identity as children of God who are welcomed at His table. It is also a call to active participation. When we remember, we aren't just spectators watching a historical drama unfold on a stage. We are participants in an ongoing relationship. We are saying yes to the grace being offered right now. We are choosing to stay inside the story rather than drifting into the isolation of our own making. This is why the table shouldn't feel like a funeral. It should feel like a homecoming celebration. It is the moment where we stop running from our needs and allow ourselves to be found by the one who has been seeking us all along. When you hold the cup, you aren't just remembering a historical tragedy. You are remembering a triumph of love over every force that tries to diminish human worth. You are remembering that you have a future because of what was accomplished in the past. True remembrance changes the pacing of our lives. It forces us to slow down enough to realize that the most important things in life are not the things we achieve, but the things we receive. We live in a doing culture, but the table is a being reality. We are called to simply be with Him. By remembering, we are inviting the presence of the past to fill the vacuum of our present. We are declaring that the work is finished, the debt is paid, and the relationship is restored. This is the hidden meaning of that small instruction. It is a tool for spiritual reorientation. It is the compass that points us back to our true home every time we feel lost in the wilderness of the routine. As we move toward understanding the communal nature of this meal, we have to realize that this remembrance is not just personal. It is a shared history. We are remembering together. We are identifying ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a grander narrative that spans centuries and continents. The bread we break is the same bread broken by the saints who came before us and the believers who will come after us. It is the thread that binds the family of God together across time. When we remember correctly, we don't just feel better, we know better. We know who we are, we know whose we are, and we know exactly where we are going. One of the most powerful aspects of this meal that often gets lost in our modern, individualistic culture is its deeply communal nature. We have been conditioned by our society to treat our faith as a private matter, a secret transaction between me and God. When we take the bread and the cup, our natural instinct is to bow our heads, close our eyes, and try to forget that there is anyone else in the room. We treat it as a moment of personal meditation, but the very word communion implies a shared experience. It is a common union. It is the physical manifestation of the fact that there are no solo travelers in this journey. To sit at the table is to acknowledge that you are part of a body that is much larger and more diverse than your own individual perspective. In the early church, this meal was a radical statement of social and spiritual reconciliation. We must remember that the world of the first century was deeply fractured. It was a world divided by rigid walls of race, economic status, gender, and political power. There were very few places where a master and a slave, or a Roman and a non-Roman, would ever sit together as equals. But the table was the one place where those walls were systematically torn down. When you share a single loaf of bread, you are making a public declaration that you share the same fundamental human need. You are acknowledging that the person sitting next to you, the one who might frustrate you, the one you might disagree with, or the one who comes from a completely different walk of life, is a recipient of the exact same grace that you are. Communion is a reminder that we are not called to be a collection of isolated islands, but a single continent of faith. When we eat together, we are practicing a profound form of humility. We are admitting, by our very presence at the table, that none of us has it all figured out. None of us has earned our place through our own merit. None of us is better or more deserving than the person in the next seat. We are all gathered as people who are hungry for something we cannot provide for ourselves. This shared vulnerability is the glue that holds the community together. It is a place where we discern the body, which means more than just thinking about the physical body of Christ on the cross. It means recognizing the presence of Christ in our brothers and sisters. This has profound implications for how we live our lives once we leave the sanctuary and head back into the world. If we are one at the table, how can we be divided in our daily lives? The act of taking the cup together is a nudge toward reconciliation. It is a silent call to forgive others just as we have been forgiven. It is a reminder that our shared identity in Christ is infinitely more important than our personal preferences, our political leanings, or our cultural differences. When we look at the person next to us through the lens of the broken bread, we no longer see a stranger or an opponent. We see someone for whom a great price was paid. We see someone who carries the same sacred promise that we do. The table serves as a vision of what human community is actually supposed to look like. It is a community built not on shared opinions or shared interests, but on shared grace. It is a place where we don't have to perform, pretend, or protect our reputation. We can simply show up in our common need. In a world that is becoming increasingly fractured, lonely, and polarized, the table offers an alternative reality. It is a place of belonging that isn't dependent on our performance or our status. When we take communion together, we are rehearsing for a future where all things are made whole. We are saying that despite our differences, we belong to each other because we belong to Him. This communal aspect is the hidden meaning that can transform our families and our congregations. It moves the focus away from my experience and toward our life. It reminds us that we are responsible for one another. If one person at the table is hurting, we all feel it. If one person is rejoicing, we all celebrate. The bread we break is a testimony that we are not alone in our struggles. We are part of a family that spans continents and centuries. We are part of a lineage of grace. By eating together, we are renewing our commitment to walk with each other, to bear each other's burdens, and to reflect the unity of heaven in a divided world. It is a sacred bond that no earthly power has the authority to break. As we arrive at the final movement of this journey, the question remains, how do we actually approach this table? If we want to move past the heaviness of the routine and into the warmth of the relationship, what should our posture be? For many generations, believers have been taught to approach communion with a sense of intense, almost crushing self-examination. We have been told to look deep within our hearts and find every hidden flaw, every stray thought, and every minor failing before we even think about touching the bread. This has often led to a state of spiritual paralysis, where we are more focused on our own shortcomings than on the grace being offered. While reflection and honesty are healthy and necessary for growth, the table was never intended to be a courtroom where you are placed on trial. It is not an interrogation room, it is a dining room. You are not a defendant, you are a guest. Approaching the table should be an act of clarity rather than anxiety. It is a moment to look at your life with total honesty, but to do so through the lens of a promise that has already been kept. If you find brokenness in your heart, if you find anger, fear, or a sense of failure, the table is exactly where you belong. The invitation is not for the person who has it all together. It is for the person who is weary and needs a place to rest. You do not wait until you are clean to come to the table, any more than you wait until you are full to sit down for dinner. You come to the table because you are hungry. You come because you need to be reminded that you are already washed in a love that does not depend on your perfection. This shift from performance to presence is where the peace begins. It is the realization that the host of the table has already examined you, knows your heart, and has still said, "Come and sit." We should approach with a profound sense of gratitude. This isn't an emotional hype that you have to manufacture or a feeling you have to drum up to prove you are spiritual. It is a deep, quiet, and settled thank you. It is gratitude for a story that is much bigger than your mistakes. It is gratitude for a promise that does not fluctuate based on your moods or your performance during the week. Gratitude acts as a filter for our perspective. When we are thankful, it is very difficult to be afraid. We look at the bread and the cup not as a test we have to pass, but as a gift we get to receive. This gratitude acts as a shield against the noise of the world. It protects the sacredness of the pause and allows you to breathe in the reality of grace. It turns the act of eating into an act of worship. Awareness is the final key to this posture. In the rush of a busy service or the distractions of a crowded room, it is so easy to let the mind drift to the next task. But the physical elements of the bread and the cup are designed to anchor you in the present moment. God chose food and drink as the symbols of this union because they are tactile and undeniable. Feel the texture of the bread in your hand. Taste the juice. Let these physical sensations remind you that God is not just a distant theological idea or a philosophical concept. He is a present reality who meets us in the most basic, elemental parts of human life, bread and drink. He sanctifies the ordinary. By being aware of the physical act, you are signaling to your soul that the spiritual act is just as real. You are telling your mind that for these few moments, nothing else matters but the connection between you and the one who invited you. There is no pressure to have a mountaintop emotional experience every single time you take communion. We live in a culture that is obsessed with highs. We want to feel a certain intensity in everything we do. But faith is often found in the quiet, steady lows. Sometimes communion will just be a quiet, subtle moment of peace. Sometimes it will simply be a mental reminder that you are not alone in your struggle, and that is enough. The hidden meaning is that the power of the table doesn't come from your intensity or your focus. It comes from the host's invitation. You aren't making the meal sacred. The meal is already sacred, and it is making you whole. You are coming to the table to be recentered, not to be entertained. This peaceful approach also changes how we view the people around us. When we approach without fear, we stop comparing ourselves to others. We stop wondering if the person next to us is more worthy than we are. Instead, we see a room full of people who are just like us, people who are sustained by the same bread and saved by the same grace. This creates a bond of genuine humility. We realize that we are all standing on level ground at the foot of the cross. The peace we receive at the table is a peace we are meant to share. As we take the cup, we are drinking in the very life that allows us to forgive the unforgivable and love the unlovable. Finally, approaching with peace means leaving the unworthy label behind. The scripture about taking communion in an unworthy manner was never meant to be a permanent brand on your soul. It was a warning against a casual, disrespectful attitude toward the sacredness of the relationship. To approach worthily is simply to approach with a heart that recognizes its need and a mind that recognizes the gift. It is to approach with a yes in your spirit. When you say Amen as you receive the elements, you are agreeing with heaven's assessment of you that you are loved, you are redeemed, and you belong. This is the posture of a child coming to a father's table. It is simple, it is quiet, and it is profoundly powerful. It is the way of peace. As we move away from the table and back into the flow of our daily lives, we must realize that the true meaning of communion does not stay behind in the church building. The goal of this sacred pause is to fundamentally change how we walk through the rest of our week. If we have been recentered in our identity at the table, then we should walk into our workplaces, our homes, and our communities as people who finally know who they are. We carry the remembrance with us as a living shield. We carry the common union with us as a bridge to others. The table is the training ground for a life lived in a state of perpetual grace, where the ritual is the anchor, but the life is the ocean. The deepest realization that most Christians miss is that the table is a living table. It is a constant invitation that remains open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. While we may only physically participate in the elements occasionally, we are called to live in the reality of that promise every single second. Every time you choose to forgive someone who has wronged you, you are discerning the body. Every time you choose to be honest about your needs, instead of hiding behind a mask of perfection, you are breaking bread. Every time you choose to find your value in God's love rather than the world's approval, you are remembering Him. The physical act of communion is the reset button for our souls, but the life of communion is the daily walk of faith. We must stop living as spiritual orphans who are constantly trying to earn their way into a family they already belong to. The table has already declared the verdict over your life. You are a son or a daughter. It has already declared that the debt is gone and the relationship is fully restored. If we can carry this table awareness into the world, it changes how we handle stress, how we treat those who oppose us, and how we view our own futures. We are no longer people who are lacking. We are people who have been fed. We are no longer people who are alone. We are people who have been brought into a global and eternal family. This awareness turns every mundane meal into a moment of gratitude and every difficult interaction into an opportunity for grace. In a world that is obsessed with productivity and doing, the table stands as a monument to being. It reminds us that our primary function is not to produce, but to receive and reflect. When we live from the table, we stop running toward a destination and start walking from a foundation. We realize that the most important work has already been done, and our job is simply to align ourselves with that finished work. This doesn't make us passive, It makes us powerful. It gives us a poise and a peace that the world cannot understand and certainly cannot take away. It allows us to face the storms of life with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly where their next meal is coming from. The hidden meaning of communion is that it is the end of the religious struggle. It is the place where striving dies and trust is born. It is the place where we stop trying to reach God and realize that God has already reached us. When we understand that this meal is about identity, belonging, and the steady, unbreakable rhythm of a promise, the routine problem disappears forever. The routine becomes a welcome heartbeat, a steady pulse that keeps us spiritually alive in a world that is trying to pull us in 1,000 different directions at once. So, as you go forward from this moment, let the table be your ultimate compass. When the noise of the world starts to tell you that you are a failure, remember the bread. When the shadows of your past try to whisper that you are unworthy or unwanted, remember the cup. When you feel isolated, misunderstood, or disconnected from those around you, remember the common union of the broken loaf. You are a guest at the most important meal in human history, and the host of that meal has already said that he will never leave you or forsake you. The table is set, the invitation is permanent, and the grace is inexhaustible. Walk in the peace of knowing that you have a place, you have a name, and you have a home. You are no longer just a person with a routine, you are a person with a promise.